ADN 40 Radio. ADN 40 Radio. Siempre conmigo.
Bienvenidos a todos a la segunda temporada de Cripto360. Yo soy Pepe Fernández y el día de hoy, en este primer episodio de la nueva temporada, comenzaremos con una nueva dinámica. Dividiremos cada uno de los episodios iniciando por una cápsula informativa que permitirá a todos ustedes tener una base común básica que permitirá el mejor aprovechamiento, el mayor entendimiento de lo que después se platicará con nuestro invitado. Posteriormente tendremos la conversación en la que trataremos de llevar a ustedes, como lo hemos hecho anteriormente, a los más importantes exponentes teóricos y prácticos de lo que está sucediendo en el mundo de las criptomonedas, de Bitcoin, de la tecnología financiera y de la tecnología en general. Y posteriormente, por último, aunque eso ocurrirá a partir del próximo episodio, tendremos recomendaciones. Nuestra sección Cripto Tips, en la que les daremos a ustedes algunos consejos o recomendaciones de cuestiones que sea práctico, útil, que practiquen, que descarguen, que lean, que vean, etc. Esa es la nueva estructura de esta nueva temporada. Espero que la disfruten mucho y por lo pronto comenzamos con la primera cápsula.
A 15 años de su creación por Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin es la criptomoneda con el mayor market cap del mundo. Su aparición en la escena financiera ha significado una verdadera revolución, al permitir la transferencia de valor sin intermediarios, como los bancos centrales y privados, y de un modo transparente y seguro. Sus detractores, que provienen sobre todo del sector de intermediación que hace prescindible, ven con recelo la posibilidad de que dicho sector desaparezca y de que el mercado financiero no pueda ser controlado por nadie. Hoy, los retos se concentran en tener una regulación cada vez mejor, en la multiplicación de los casos de uso y en una mayor adopción, que permita a cualquier persona intercambiar valor libre y directamente con otras.
Ahora les dejaré la conversación que tuve con Samson Mow. Él es CEO de Yan3, una empresa muy relevante en el mundo de Bitcoin, y él, además de ser CEO de esa empresa, es uno de los más vocales y activos expositores sobre todos los temas que tienen que ver con criptomonedas y muy en particular de Bitcoin en el mundo. Espero que la disfruten.
Samson, it's fantastic to have you here in Cripto360, Cripto360. I have seen you in El Salvador, in Buenos Aires, in Miami, and I had always wanted you to be here in this podcast.
Well,
thank you for
It's great to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Pepe.
So let me ask you this one first general question. That is, in your general opinion, is Bitcoin pure innovation?
I believe so. It's the first time we've discovered decentralized, immutable, permissionless money. So in all the history of civilization, we've never had something like Bitcoin before. Mm-hmm. We've had things like gold, which served as a decent medium of exchange and store of value for some time. Mm-hmm. But the problem with gold is it's difficult to store and manage. And Bitcoin has solved that problem because now money is just information, and information can be stored very easily. You don't have to have bricks and transport them by truck and boat. You can send it over the internet, over radio waves, on a piece of paper. So it changes the entire dynamic of our relationship to money. And I think it's for the better of civilization because historically, the corruption of money always leads to the downfall of civilizations.
Mm-hmm. You state that Bitcoin is money and also that Bitcoin is information, right? Mm-hmm. And I agree. But sometimes in some jurisdictions, regulation doesn't. Regulation disagree with that. So my question is, what do you think about this?
Well, the thing is, money comes before regulation. Money is simply a means by which people interact with one another, how we exchange our time and energy with one another. Now, Bitcoin is information and energy. It is an energy-based money that is in the form of information. So it makes it very porous, very transportable. And that is why it supersedes regulation, because you cannot regulate information. Governments have tried, right? You can block sites on the internet, restrict people's access to information. In the darker ages, you burn books, but that never really works because information is pervasive. It's just everywhere. And the only way to counteract the spread of information is through surveillance states or authoritarian measures. And to control Bitcoin, basically you have to stick a camera in someone's home and monitor them 24/7 to make sure they didn't write down some information on a piece of paper. And I don't think that's a state that anyone wants to live in, right? That's a pure Orwellian hell. So states can try to regulate Bitcoin and say, this is money and it must be controlled. But that is fighting against the tide. It's fighting against the ocean. Yeah. And it also is detrimental to countries and nation states as well. I think it's almost a lost art of governance that you need money to be fluid and liquid. You need it moving from place to place. If you go back to first principles thinking, where does prosperity and money come from? It comes from people. If you simplify it and say every country in the world is simply 10 people, which ones are going to be more prosperous? It's the ones that draw others to that country. So let's say you're a country of 10, I'm a country of 10. We all have the same GDP. How do I grow? I need people from your country to come work in my country, develop technology, bring money from your country to my country. So you see, it's very critical that you have the ability to move capital and move human capital. And the more prosperous countries will be the ones that embrace money as money. And I think this is something we'll have to relearn over time, because when countries become prosperous, they generally tend towards ossification, creating those regulations that you talked about that try to protect what they have, right? Capital controls are one measure that countries try to implement to keep what they have inside, right? But there are ways to bypass that. Now, especially with something like money being information, those things are largely irrelevant. So you have to compete on the premise of the free market. You have to compete in the free market because everything is a free market with Bitcoin. So countries have to become places people want to go to, right? You have to decrease crime, increase the beneficial conditions, like things are nice, roads are nice, schools are nice. You want to have your kids go to school in this country, and standards of living are good, and then you can compete. So I guess that's a long answer to your question.
Perfect. And now that you mentioned energy, let's talk about the environmental concern regarding Bitcoin.
Yeah, so
that's a big concern, right?
It's a big concern by people that want to attack Bitcoin in terms of energy usage. So I believe places like this, the University, the Libertad, is very important because it teaches people about critical thinking and first principle thought, like thinking about things from a simple toy model and then extrapolating that toy model to the larger world. So let's go to the energy part. Oftentimes in the media, they'll say Bitcoin uses as much energy as this country, this small country. That line of thinking applies to everything. It can be Bitcoin. It uses as much energy as a small country. Clothes dryers also use the same amount of energy if you add it all up. Washing machines, Christmas lights, everything. You pick one thing and you add it up, it'll equal the energy consumption of a small country. So that is really a misleading statement when they say Bitcoin uses too much energy. And the other thing we have to break down is, what is too much energy? That is effectively trying to limit what people can use energy for. Can you take a drive in the countryside? That's using energy. Is that a good use of energy? Maybe not, right? And it's bleeding into very ridiculous areas too. Like in California, they were trying to limit the sales of high-performance computers that gamers use with powerful graphics card that consume a lot of energy. So they're saying gaming is not a good use of energy. But when you go down this path of what we are okay to use energy for, you're going back to the authoritarian state, which is dictating what energy can be used for, and that's very dangerous.
What is good and what is bad.
Yeah, maybe it's bad to use energy for a podcast to talk about things, and that is a way to stop the spread of information, right? There's a lot of subterfuge here at play, and I think people have to become aware of these things. When Bitcoin is being attacked for energy usage, it is a very carefully constructed thing. And in fact, Greenpeace USA, they were paid $5 million to launch a campaign to force Bitcoin to change its code to proof of stake and reduce energy usage. But energy is a very crucial part of Bitcoin. It is because Bitcoin is an energy currency that it is very, very difficult to corrupt. Because you can't print Bitcoin. You have to use energy to extract Bitcoin or mine Bitcoin, right? There's no shortcut. Now, with a proof of stake system, you can push a button, you can change the rules of the code. There is no energy shield that protects it at all. And it's the same for the fiat monetary systems, like central banking systems. There is no energy shield. It is just a computer which the head of the central bank can push a button on and print more money. But you can't do that with Bitcoin because you must consume energy to get Bitcoin. And it's the same as gold mining. You cannot just snap your fingers and have gold appear. You have to go dig it out of the ground, refine it, etc. And this is the core of proof of work, which is you have to work. Just like we have to work. We have to do our jobs and then we get paid. We don't just snap our fingers and get paid, right? There is work involved, and energy is simply a form of work.
I like that example. And how has the Bitcoin changed the landscape of finance and investing?
Well, I think it still has a long way to go, but we're seeing now institutional interest in Bitcoin. We're seeing major institutional funds like BlackRock launch spot ETFs, and it's likely they will get approved. So what that will do is open the door for normal retail investors to jump into Bitcoin, because Bitcoin self-custody is still a barrier. And it's easier for people just to buy it on a stock exchange or a brokerage. So I think that Bitcoin as a reserve currency is just right around the corner, where Bitcoin is simply money for the world. And we call that hyper-Bitcoinization. It's a point at which everyone just uses Bitcoin in the world, and you don't use dollars anymore. Everything is done in Bitcoin. Trade is settled in Bitcoin. You buy your groceries in Bitcoin. You pay your rent in Bitcoin.
Well, now that you mentioned use cases, what are your preferred use cases for Bitcoin? Do you believe it as a payment system or you don't?
Well, I guess I would say my preferred use case of Bitcoin is money. Now, money can be used as payments, or it can be used as a savings mechanism, right? And oftentimes it's misunderstood. People say that hodling Bitcoin or holding your Bitcoin is not a use case of Bitcoin, but it is actually a very strong use case, right? The boomer generation, the baby boomers, they use real estate to store value. And in that boom, they managed to come out of it pretty well because they had a good store of value for that time. Now, real estate has changed dramatically now, right? There's some oversupply. But Bitcoin is that better store of value, because even with real estate, you have a lot of costs, like basically demurrage for gold. You have to pay for security and storage of gold. Real estate, you have to maintain the property. You have to rent it out to pay the mortgages, and you have to service it and pay property tax. So it's not an ideal store of value, actually. And I think people are starting to figure out that something has changed. Now, Bitcoin is a far more ideal store of value because you don't have to do anything. You put it in your wallet, put your seed phrase somewhere safe, and you're pretty good. You don't have to maintain it at all. And that is a very strong use case that I think people will start to figure out over the next 5-10 years.
If you had to distinguish between the different stages of Bitcoin adoption, how would you identify them?
Well, the stages of adoption of money is that it first starts out as a store of value, then as a medium of exchange, and then eventually a unit of account. Now, Bitcoin being digital, is able to evolve on all three of those axes at the same time. We've already been using it for the past 10 plus years as a store of value and a medium of exchange. You can look around and see places where you can pay with Bitcoin. That has accelerated a lot after the launch of the Lightning Network, and where countries and cities are accepting Bitcoin for payment. So that is ramping up very quickly. But on the unit of account side, we've also been using sats, the smallest unit of account of Bitcoin, smallest unit of Bitcoin as a unit of account for transactions on the Lightning Network. When people transact on the Lightning Network, they say, send me 10 sats or 100 sats or 1,000 sats.
It is a 100,000.
It's a 100 millionth of Bitcoin. But people are already using that as the denomination when they talk about sending Bitcoin, like tips and whatnot too. So it's very interesting because we've never had something that's evolved on all three fronts at the same time. Gold evolved as a money over hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And of course, it first started out as that store of value for a very long time where people collect it because it was gold and shiny and for no other reason. And it had to evolve gradually. But Bitcoin can kind of leapfrog that very rapidly. And I think the growth trajectory is very high, just like iPhone, right? We weren't using iPhones for a long time, but in the period of about 10 years, everyone's using an iPhone or something like an iPhone. But technology allows us to grow very rapidly, and Bitcoin is technology.
Lastly, what are your predictions for the future of Bitcoin?
Well, it has a lot to do with my talk coming up, but it is that nation states will adopt Bitcoin. And it is due to necessity because the legacy financial system is fundamentally broken. Many countries are in debt, and that debt is compounding rapidly. We're seeing rampant inflation and hyperinflation around the world. And the only way to combat these things is with Bitcoin. You have to have an asymmetric bet on a new type of asset that is going to rapidly appreciate. Otherwise, the alternative is debt jubilee or defaulting on debts. And that is really not good for anybody. So the best case scenario is we transition into a Bitcoin standard and we have these countries adopt Bitcoin and run two systems in parallel. This is what we're trying to work on at my company, Jan3. We're trying to work with governments to have them understand Bitcoin and implement a Bitcoin strategy where they have two parallel tracks. They can have the peso and Bitcoin, the dollar and Bitcoin, the yen and Bitcoin, etc. And by this method, they can ease their population into Bitcoin gradually. Because in the event that we see the collapse of all these fiat systems, it will be mass chaos and a lot of human suffering. So it's better that we plan ahead and we have two parallel tracks where we can gently move them into this Bitcoin standard.
And what would you say to people that still doubt about Bitcoin, about investing, about transacting Bitcoin?
I would say go to your grocery store and see how much you're paying for your food.
Samson, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you